Our next speaker is Glenn Kolomeitz, who is a former army officer who served in Afghanistan and Timor Leste, and now he works as a lawyer doing pro bono immigration work for Afghan refugees, as well as representing survivors in military sexual trauma cases.
Thank you, Ruby, for that very generous introduction. It's almost exactly as I wrote it. Friends, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and also Aboriginal soldiers, men and women, who were prepared to fight and potentially die for this country since before Federation. A country which didn't recognise them as citizens until 1967. So I'll start by saying Assalamu alaikum, and peace be upon you all. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years. 20 years. In that time we spilt blood, we spent $10 billion, we achieved little tactically and nothing strategically. We had no strategy and therefore no reason for remaining in Afghanistan after 2001. And whatever tactical gains we may have made are now largely irrelevant. We did, however, contribute to an emerging humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan. We helped expose many Afghans to the risk of death at the hands of a vengeful Taliban. We cut and ran with little thought of looking after the Afghans who work for us, or indeed any Afghans placed at risk as a result of our operations in that country. Friends, the evacuation from Kabul was an unmitigated disaster. We've had a Senate inquiry followed by an interim report and a final report in the last week, all of which is scathing of the government's response to the Afghan crisis and indeed the Afghan refugee crisis. It's apparently, however, business as usual at Home Affairs. It's taken a year and a pre-election budget to genuinely increase humanitarian visa intake numbers for Afghans, but Home Affairs is still not processing many of these Afghans who are at risk because of their work for us. Home Affairs is still not communicating and are apparently ignoring the government's stated intention to prioritise Afghans with very strong ties to Australia. Our Senate inquiry and government directions, yet the department continues to operate in its bloated bureaucratic bubble. There are also thousands of Afghans, people from Afghanistan currently in Australia seeking asylum, who are not being provided protection. Providing safe haven to refugees from Afghanistan is consistent with the promises made by Australia to protect persecuted groups when we first entered the war in Afghanistan. It also strongly aligns with our international and moral obligations. When we deployed to Afghanistan to perform our duties as soldiers, we were told we were there to protect the people of Afghanistan and to exercise Australia's international obligations. The questions I ask, of course, are, were we misled? Was it all a lie? Why are these government departments not implementing the Australian government's stated policies and indeed our protection obligations? A week doesn't go by without veterans of the Afghanistan war contacting me, asking me what they can do to help. These veterans want to see something tangible come from that disastrous expedition to Afghanistan. Over 2 decades. When I try to explain the obstacles and bureaucratic barriers put up to securing visas, these veterans ask why this government is making it so hard for Australia to save some of the lives we've put at risk. At a time when the Australian government is trying to increase Australian Defence Force personnel numbers, its actions regarding our Afghan colleagues are having an adverse impact on the mental health of veterans and serving members who served in Afghanistan. How can this government say to young Australians, join the ADF and fight for our values, when the government and its departments openly fail to demonstrate those values? The message they are sending is, in fact, join the ADF, serve overseas on ill-defined missions, and then abandon your colleagues. That's not the ADF I joined 35 years ago. In the last few weeks, I've started receiving letters from DFAT and Home Affairs rejecting the applications for humanitarian visas by Afghan embassy guards of our embassy in Kabul. There's no rhyme nor reason to these rejections. Some of their colleagues and families are already here. How do you explain to an Afghan colleague or a family member in Australia that their friend or relative has been rejected by the Australian government when the Australian government can't even explain the rejection? How do you look them in the eyes and explain that?
Can't.
These rejection letters, as I say, contain no reasons for the rejection. There's no rhyme nor reason to these bureaucratic decisions. It's like a lottery as to which former employees of the Australian government in Afghanistan get protection and which former employees don't. This is a lottery for lives, and that is entirely unacceptable, friends. Australians I know, and veterans I know, want to make a difference both personally and nationally. The veteran community wants to make a difference personally and nationally. We neither want nor deserve this reputation for cutting and running from our mates, a reputation that's been imposed on us by government and the bureaucracy. However, the government can listen and can act. It's not too late. Even in caretaker mode, this government can compel its departments to do their jobs for which their executives are so handsomely paid. If the Department of Home Affairs is so under-resourced that it can't process visa applications and can't even communicate with applicants and their lawyers, maybe the minister should move some senior executives and mandarins to the shop floor to do some processing work. Having said that, we are enormously grateful for the additional 16,500 humanitarian places over 4 years for Afghans. That's almost good enough, but it will not be good enough. Now it's time for the government to follow through on that budgetary commitment. I and many of my brothers and sisters in arms call on the government to do just that. Action that commitment, help us to help the government to get our Afghan colleagues, the government's former employees, to Australia. Help us restore some pride and dignity from our disastrous adventure in Afghanistan.